first rule of working the night shift at Greystone Mental Health Facility: never look directly at room 319's occupant. I thought it was a joke when the head nurse, Ms. Calloway, told me that on my first night shift as a nurse. Some weird initiation ritual for rookies. But as I stood behind the reception desk at about 2:13 a.m., staring at the security monitor, what I saw on the screen was far beyond strange. My imagination ran wide. Then I realized the warning wasn't a joke at all. Room 319's camera feed was the only one that had its light flickering all through. But why? The grainy black and white display struggled to keep up with something inside. A shadow? A distortion? The eerie-looking patient was sitting on the edge of the bed, unmoving, yet the screen trembled like static was trying to blur them out. I leaned in closer with one closed, when a hand gripped my shoulder, sending down shivers down my spine. "Don't," a voice whispered. It was Paul, the only other night nurse on duty. He looked pale, his dark eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "You don't stare at that particular one." "Why? Who are they?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Paul hesitated but stuttered. "We call them the red patient." "Red?" I looked at the screen again with more rapt attention. The patient's hospital gown was white. The sheets were white. There was no red anywhere. Paul swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "You'll see, if you stay long enough." I scoffed, but there was an edge of unease curling in my stomach. I'd worked night shifts before in other places, but never in a place like this. The air felt heavier, the halls too silent, the patients' rooms lined up like tombs in a mausoleum. Greystone had a history. I had read about it before applying. A sanatorium turned asylum, then rebranded as a mental wellness center to hide its grim past. The next round of patient checks was at 2:30 a.m. Paul and I moved down the dim corridor, our footsteps softened by the linoleum. Most rooms were quiet. The patients occupying them are either sleeping or murmuring to themselves. Then we reached room 319. Paul stopped outside the door, jaw tight. He pulled a small laminated paper from his pocket. A prayer, or maybe a set of instructions. His hands trembled as he read it under his breath. I frowned and whispered, "You, okay? Just don't react," he muttered. "Whatever you see, whatever happens, do not mention it to anyone. Just close the panel, mark them as stable, and move on." I gave him a skeptical look, but nodded. He unlatched the observation panel, a small sliding window built into the door, and I leaned in to look inside. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. A pale, thin figure sat on the bed, head tilted downward, arms resting on their lap. Their hair hung in damp strands over their face. The room smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic, like old spilled blood. Then they moved. Slowly, their head turned toward me, revealing a face that wasn't quite right. Their skin had an unnatural waxy smoothness, and their lips stretched too wide like that of vampires and eerie creatures, like they had been painted on. And their eyes. My breath hitched. Their eyes weren't black or white. They weren't even eyes at all. They were red. Deep, liquid red, as if their sockets were filled with blood that hadn't spilled over. The patient smiled, and for a second, the world around me dimmed. The hallway, the floor beneath my feet, the hum of the fluorescent lights, all of it faded into a static void, leaving me with the cringiest feeling I've ever had. Then Paul slammed the panel shut. The spell broke. My chest heaved as I stumbled backward, heart pounding against my ribs. My vision returned in a disorienting blur, but I could still feel those red eyes burning into my memory, like they are staring into my soul, searching for their breathe. Paul grabbed my wrist. Breathe. Just breathe. What the hell was that? I gasped. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me his pen light and gestured down the hall. Come on, we have 8 more rooms to check. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers, but the wait in Paul's expression told me I wouldn't like the answers I will get. So I did the only thing I could. I kept moving. But in the back of my mind, something whispered. I had looked too long, and the red patient had seen me too. Sleep didn't come easy after that shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red seeping orbs staring back at me, as if they had burned into the retinas of my eyes. The feeling lingered, crawling under my skin like an itch I couldn't reach or scratch. The next night, I arrived at Greystone to find Paul already there, staring at the security monitors with a stiffness in his posture. I hesitated before stepping behind the desk. Did you sleep at all? I asked. Paul scoffed, but didn't look away from the screens. Not really. Me neither, I responded without hesitation. We fell into silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between us, my mind ruminating over the events of last night. I wanted to ask about the red patient, about what I had seen, but something in Paul's face told me he wouldn't give me answers. Not yet. At 2 a.m., the intercom crackled. We both turned toward the overhead speaker. A soft, garbled whisper came through, just a breath of sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Then a voice, faint, almost inhuman, spoke. Come and see. I felt my blood run cold immediately. The intercom wasn't connected to patient rooms. Paul stood so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He grabbed the radio on his hip, voice tight. Control, did someone just patch through the intercom? Static, then. Negative night shift. No transmission sent. I swallowed hard. Paul. Before I could finish, the security monitor for room 319 flickered violently. The screen warped, distorting in jagged, unnatural shapes. And then, just for a moment, a shape moved past the camera, a shadow spilling out from under the door, stretching toward the hall. Paul reached for my wrist and squeezed it so hard it hurt. Don't move, he said. The overhead lights dimmed, buzzing angrily. Then, down the hall, room 319's door crackled open. A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the hall as the door of room 319 swung open. The air thickened, charged with something unseen but unmistakably present. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then, there came soft footsteps, bare feet against linoleum, moving toward us. Paul grabbed my arm, his fingers ice cold. We should run, now. But my legs refused to move. The footsteps were getting closer. A shadow flickered in the dim light at the end of the hall, stretching unnaturally long against the floor. The intercom crackled again. I can see you. The voice wasn't human. A guttural, static roar erupted from the speaker. The lights above flickered violently once again, distorting shadows along the walls. The footsteps turned into rapid, shuffling scrapes. Something was running. Paul yanked me backward as the hallway plunged into darkness. A deafening silence followed afterwards. Then, inches from us, a whisper. It's not yet time. The lights snapped back on. The hallway was empty, but the door to room 319 stood wide open. As usual, sleep never came after that shift. Even after leaving Greystone, I felt like something was watching me, something I couldn't shake. The shadows in my apartment stretched wrong. The air felt heavier, and the silence was never quite complete. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something more than paranoia. The air conditioning unit in my bedroom started making strange noises, soft rattling sounds at first, then slow, measured tapping, as if someone was knocking from the inside of the vent. I forced myself to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing but a loose piece of metal shifting with the airflow. Then, at exactly 3:19 a.m., my phone buzzed with an unknown caller ID. I hesitated at first, then answered. The line crackled. A faint, inhuman whisper slithered through. "I can still see you." The air around me turned ice cold. My breath hitched in my throat as I scanned the dimly lit room. The shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. Then, from the hallway outside my bedroom, a single, deliberate knock. I froze. My phone slipped from my fingers, landing on the bed beside me. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps, unhurried, expectant. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My heartbeat sounded like a thunder in my ears. Then the doorknob rattled. My pulse spiked. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I wasn't home. But I already knew that whatever stood on the other side of that door knew I was here. Another knock. This time, closer, like the door was right in my face. The sound didn't come from the hallway anymore. It came from inside the room. Slowly, I turned my head toward my closet. The door stood slightly opened, a sliver of darkness visible between the frame. I had left it shut before going to bed. A soft exhale slipped through the gap. I grabbed my bedside lamp, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, with a sharp breath, I yanked the closet door open, and there was nothing. Just empty space. My clothes hung in still, undisturbed rows, with patterns as it should be. The shadows didn't shift. The air felt no different. Then my phone buzzed again. I turned it over with trembling fingers. The screen was cracked from the drop, but one notification stood out. A single text from an unknown number. "I can still see you." A cold dread sank into my bones. My gaze flapped back to the closet, and in the mirror inside, just for a fraction of a second, I saw something move. A flash of red. Immediately my mind recalled the incident of the red patient. I slammed the closet door shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By sunrise, I had already made up my mind. I had to go back to Greystone. I needed to know what the red patient had done to me. Returning to Greystone Mental Health Wellness Center felt inevitable. Whatever had followed me home the night before hadn't left, and the only way to understand it was to go back to the source where it came from. The hospital halls were even quieter than I remembered. The air smelled of antiseptic, but beneath it, something foul lingered, like stagnant water or old, rotting wood. The fluorescent lights buzzed slightly as I walked past empty rooms, patients murmuring behind closed doors. I reached the nurse's station, but Paul wasn't there. Only Miss Calloway, her sharp gaze pinning me in place. "You're early today," she said. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That happens to those who stay too long." She slid me the night shift checklist, but before I could reach for it, I noticed something. The patient lists. Room 319. It was blank. No name, no medical records, just an empty space where their identity should have been. A shiver crawled down my spine. Miss Calloway. Who is the red patient? And where is he? She hesitated. For the first time, I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Fear. Some questions are better left unanswered. Before I could push further, a sound echoed through the halls. A slow, rhythmic tapping, coming from room 319. I turned my head toward the dark corridor. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a pattern. A slow, deliberate knock against the door. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. like it was calling me. I stepped forward without thinking. Ms. Calloway's voice cut through my trance. "Don't go any further." I froze. "Why not?" "Because it knows you now, and once it knows you, it never forgets your identity." The knocking stopped, and then the door to room 319 creaked open on its own. A deep, suffocating cold poured into the hallway, swallowing the dim light. My breath misted in front of me as an unnatural silence fell, pressing against my eardrums. Then, from the darkness beyond the open door, a whisper slithered through. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was a sound that crawled under my skin, vibrating through my bones like an echo from somewhere I wasn't meant to hear. Something moved inside the room. Slow, deliberate shuffling against the floor. Then a footstep, then another, coming closer. Miss Calloway grabbed my arm, her grip ice cold. "Run, now." And then, from the darkness of room 319, something stepped into the hall. The thing that stepped out of room 319 was not human. Its silhouette was wrong, too tall, too thin, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. The creature so eerie that you can't even look at for long. The dim hallway lights flapped as it moved, its presence distorting reality all around it. Ms. Calloway's grip on my arm tightened as she whispered, "Don't move. Don't breathe. Hold your breath." The air was thick and cold, pressing against my skin like a suffocating weight. The thing's head twitched as if listening, its faceless form scanning the hallway. Then it took a step forward. A sickening creak echoed through the corridor, and I realized its feet weren't touching the ground. It hovered just slightly above, drifting toward us with an unnatural stillness. My lungs burned as I fought the instinct to run. Then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it stopped. It turned its head, if it even had one, toward me. And though it had no eyes, I knew it saw me. A whisper filled the air, a chorus of voices layered over one another. "You look too long." The lights flashed unsteadily and violently as usual, and before I could react, everything went dark. A scream erupted from somewhere down the hall, a guttural, agonized wail that sent ice through my veins. I turned, my pulse hammering, and felt Miss Calloway yank me backward. "Run!" We bolted down the corridor, the shadows shifting unnaturally around us. Doors rattled as if unseen hands were trying to claw their way out. The lights blinked in and out, revealing glimpses of something moving along the walls, crawling, twitching shapes that melted into the darkness when the lights returned. We reached the nurse's station, slamming the door shut behind us. Miss Calloway locked it, breathing hard. That wasn't supposed to happen. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. She didn't answer. Instead, she moved toward the security monitor and rewound the footage. I watched, my stomach twisting, as the camera for room 319 fluttered and distorted. For a brief second, between the static, something stared back at us. Not the patient. Something worse than the patient. A shadow of something far bigger than the room itself, stretching beyond the walls, its presence pressing against the lens as if it could crawl through the screen. And then, as if it knew we were watching, the screen went blank and black within a twinkle of an eye. A faint knock tapped against the door to the nurse's station. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Miss Calloway paled to me. "We're not alone." The 3 knocks against the nurse's station door sent a sharp chill down my spine. The air in the small room started to thicken up, as if the unseen force beyond the door was pressing against the walls, waiting for an answer and wouldn't go away without one. Ms. Calloway held up a single finger to her lips, signaling me to remain silent. I nodded, barely breathing. My ears strained for any further sounds, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the knocks themselves. Then a voice. It wasn't quite human. It carried a distorted, multi-layered timbre, as if multiple voices were speaking at once from different planes of existence. Let us in. Now. My chest tightened, and I instinctively shook my head. Ms. Calloway's expression remained unreadable, but I could see the sweat forming on her brow. She knew what this was. She had faced it before. Another knock, this time more insistent. You've seen us. The security monitor flickered again, and through the static, room 319's door stood wide open. The patient, the red patient, was gone. I turned back to the station door, the handle twitching as if something were testing it, pushing against the barrier, keeping it at bay. Then, with an ear-splitting screech, the handle twisted violently before falling still. Miss Calloway finally moved, grabbing a small vial from the drawer beneath the desk. She poured its contents, a thick, tar-like substance, along the bottom of the door. The second it made contact with the wood, the temperature in the room shifted. The tension in the air eased slightly, and the knocking stopped. She exhaled shakily. We don't acknowledge them. We don't let them in. What the hell are they? My voice was barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted to the now static security feed. They don't belong here any longer. A long silence stretched between us before she finally turned to me. We need to find that patient before it finds us. Then the emergency alarm blared through the facility, drowning us in red flashing lights. Over the wailing siren, a new sound emerged. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It came from the hallway, just outside the station. Slowly, I turned toward the glass window of the station door. A long, pale arm stretched into view, fingers impossibly elongated, nails tapping lightly against the glass. Then another arm, then a head. It was smiling. The emergency alarm's wail faded into the distance as Ms. Calloway and I rushed through the dimly lit corridor. The red lights flashed erratically, casting shifting shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. Room 319 was empty. That patient, if they were even human, was now loose inside the facility. We passed the common area, and the large windows on the far end showed something unnatural. The outside world, the city skyline that should have been beyond those windows, was gone. Instead, an endless void of pulsating darkness stretched into the abyss. It wasn't just night, it was nothingness. Ms. Calloway cursed under her breath. It's worse than I thought. We don't have much time left. I barely had time to process that before the overhead speakers crackled to life. A garbled voice emerged, warped and echoing, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. You shouldn't have seen. My stomach twisted. I knew that voice. I've heard it before. It belonged to the red patient. A cold gust swept through the hallway, sending a shiver up my spine. The doors lining the corridor rattled violently, patients inside wailing in distress. The entire building felt like it was shifting, reality itself growing unstable. We had to act fast. Where would it go? I asked, trying to ignore the growing unease creeping into my bone marrows. Ms. Calloway's expression was grim. The lower levels. There are things down there, places it can use. I didn't like the sound of that. Another static-filled voice slithered through the speakers. Come and find me. A deep, dragging noise echoed from the stairwell ahead, and then something started laughing. The laughter echoed down the corridor, curling into a grotesque symphony of distorted voices. It wasn't just the red patient laughing anymore. There were many others. More voices, layered over one another, some deep and guttural, others high, eerie and unnatural. Miss Calloway's grip on my wrist tightened. We don't have time to hesitate. We have to contain it now. The stairwell loomed ahead, a yawning black void swallowing the dim emergency lighting. The walls pulsed subtly, like the very fabric of the hospital was shifting. We descended quickly, each step echoing too long, as if the stairwell stretched beyond its physical dimensions. A flickering bulb barely illuminated the lower level. The air down here was heavier, damp with something that smelled like mildew and copper. The hallway before us led to the restricted archives, a place I'd never seen before, but had heard whispers about. The doors were already open. Inside, the shadows moved. A figure stood at the far end facing the wall, its frame unnaturally still. My breath hitched as the figure slowly turned. The red patient. Their hospital gown was no longer white, but drenched in something dark, dripping onto the floor in slow, rhythmic drops. Their red, empty sockets bore into me. Miss Calloway stepped forward, murmuring something under her breath, but before she could act, the wall shuddered violently. The laughter rose again, distorting into shrieks. The floor beneath us cracked, dark tendrils slithering up through the fissures. "It's feeding," Miss Calloway gasped. "We have to break its connection with the prey." The red patient raised a single, bloodied hand, and the lights overhead shattered in unison. Then the darkness swallowed us whole, and for a moment, I thought we had fallen into nothingness. But then, a wave of dim emergency lighting sputtered back, the moment back to life, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. The red patient stood motionless, their head tilted slightly as though listening. The laughter had stopped. The silence was worse. Miss Calloway gripped my wrist tighter, her voice barely a whisper. "We have only one chance. We cut off the connection now, or it takes everything." "How?" My voice was hoarse, the fear clawing at my throat. The walls around us seemed to pulse, veins of dark red creeping through the plaster. "It's tied to this place, bound here," she murmured, pulling a scalpel from her pocket. "Blood seals blood. We cut its anchor." The red patient took a step toward us. The air turned suffocating, a thick, wet pressure pressing against my lungs. My vision blurred, my legs trembling beneath me. But Miss Calloway was already moving, carving a line into her own palm, letting droplets of her blood splatter onto the floor. The shadows recoiled. The red patient let out a low, guttural hiss, their body convulsing. The red in their sockets darkened, swirling, thickening, as though it was being drained away. "Help me," Miss Calloway shouted. I didn't think. I pressed my own palm against the scalpel, feeling the sharp sting as blood welled up. The moment my blood mixed with hers on the floor, the entire building groaned, as if it were alive and in pain. The red patient screamed. A high, inhuman wail filled the space, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The walls were still. The air was light. The floor beneath us was cracked but unmoving. It was over. Or so I thought. As we stumbled out of the basement, Miss Calloway's face was pale, her lips pressed into a grim line. It's never truly gone, only waiting for when it will come back. I turned back, staring into the dim hallway, and in the distorted light, just for a second, I swore I saw red eyes watching me, waiting, The weight of exhaustion pressed against my shoulders as I clocked out that morning. As I stepped outside, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I told myself I would never return. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Greystone doesn't let you go. Not really. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, comment, and turn the notification on for more chilling tales. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness.